We're not going to talk about Frida Kahlo. Frida Kahlo has become one of the most popular women artists in the last decade or so. There's been a movie, there's been exhibitions, and there just seems to be a tremendous response to her artwork and to her life story, which is pretty much intertwined with her artwork. She's pretty autobiographical in her art. She is, as you can see, a Mexican artist. And her paintings are, as I said, autobiographical. Autobiographical often with very strange, probably symbolic and evocative imagery. Sometimes, knowing her life story, you can pretty much figure out what the imagery means. Other times, it's very mysterious, and people. She didn't leave us a little dictionary to tell us what everything meant. In fact, she was painting primarily for herself. And the subject that she paints over and over and over again is her own self-portrait. So her face is just very, very well known. And one of the things, of course, she does is she has these heavy eyebrows, and rather than pluck them out, she leaves them in her painting as part of the autobiographical or physical image of herself. I probably should say something about that. Today, we would generally pluck eyebrows, maybe not as thin as some of the people did earlier in the 20th century, but they would pluck them out. There's another period of time when you see these two arches that sort of meet, and I'm thinking of Byzantine art, which also, of course, is very iconic art that is created as an image rather than as an imitation. And hers, of course, involves imitation and involves making herself into a kind of icon. She said there were two actually devastating accidents in her life. The first one was a horrible bus accident. The second one was meeting Diego Rivera. And those two events pretty much colored her life and, as you'll see, her art. In 1925, she was in a horrible traffic accident. She was riding on a bus and a streetcar collided with the bus. Evidently, she was something metal went completely through her. So there were internal injuries, there were massive broken bones. At the time, she was riding with, I think it was her fiance, her boyfriend, whom she did not marry, but he insisted that she be getting treatment because they were doing triage and they said she can't live. They were just going to let her die. And he insisted that she be treated. They were able to save her. But it was a permanent injury. She had to wear braces. She had to have multiple surgeries through her whole life, and she had pain throughout her whole life. This work you see here, Henry Ford Hospital, is referring to the treatments of and the pain and the suffering that she goes through. It's much later, obviously, than the accident, but that pain and the consequences are still with her. And you might see this little embryonic shape. It meant that she could not have children. Many of her self-portraits do deal with the physical pain of the accident, and others deal with the personal pain from her relationship with Diego Rivera, which we'll talk about shortly. This one's still dealing with the accident. It's called The Broken Column. It's from 1944. And you see her mostly nude, open, fragmented. And you see this, it looks like a metal spinal column or a spire or something, which essentially is her injured, shattered spine. But here, calling it a column. She herself is the column, too. So there is the injury there. There are all these straps going around her, and almost like keeping her together, otherwise she'll fall apart, or lacing her in. And so I think there's probably psychological as well as the physiological idea of having to wear back braces and having to be confined. And then her life is also confined. There's this idea of the ravines and the barren landscape behind her, and she was barren. And then she is cut into just like the landscape. The second great accident of her life, as it were, was her relationship with Diego Rivera. This is called Frida and Diego. And Diego Rivera at this time was very, very famous, probably the most famous Mexican artist, and he had an international reputation. He is known as a great muralist. And so here is her picture showing them. And it shows Diego, of course, was a large man. He was overweight most of his life, and he was just his great large presence. But she shows him, of course, as very large and her very small. And he is holding the palette. She is dressed in traditional Mexican costume, which both Diego liked, and which, because it's also somewhat flamboyant. It also referred to her concern about her identity as a Mexican with partial ancestry from the native tribes through her mother. And also it helped to hide the unevenness of her legs and the fact that she had to wear braces and things like that because she could wear this long dress. So there's a number of reasons why she often dressed in the traditional Mexican garments. But she shows herself here more as a traditional wife. She's smaller. She holds his hand. She's not showing herself as a painter. And despite the fact that she's painting throughout her life, and as we'll see, she does get exhibited and she does get some recognition. She, like I guess many artists, both male and female, and particularly many female artists, may have some doubts about here's the great, Diego Rivera, and who am I as an artist next to him? Of course, right now I think Kahlo may be actually more popular, which is a change. When I was in school, they mentioned Diego Rivera. They never talked about Frida Kahlo. I never heard of her at that time. She married Diego. It was a tumultuous marriage. They fought. They both had affairs. He would have affairs, and then she would have an affair, I guess, in reaction. And at one point, they got divorced. And then that was in 1939. And then the next year, they got remarried. They couldn't stay away. Their political agenda, they were communists. They believed, that communism would help rectify many of the inequities that were true in Mexican society with the, poor Native Americans, Native American Mexican indigenous peoples being suppressed and kept very, very poor with the colonial influence coming in. So this was something that they were very much part of, was the communist movement. In fact, Frida Kahlo had an affair with Tolstoy. When Tolstoy was deposed, he came to Mexico, and he did live with Frida at their house. He was in political asylum. And she painted this self-portrait dedicated to Leon Trotsky. Dates, it has very clear inscriptions. Some of her works have very clear inscriptions, so they're dated, and you know something about them. But this is from 1937, and it's in the National Museum of Women in the Arts. All of her work is fairly small scale. So there's they're painted, as we said, they seem to be painted for herself, at least at first. The pose is something that you sometimes see in native Mexican art. Of course, she's using these iconic, formal, simplified poses. It's interesting because she's not depicted as a revolutionary here. As you can see, she has a beautiful long garment and the shawl and the ruffles and the embroidery on the skirt. She's depicted in more upper class or aristocratic mode rather than as an aristocrat. I mean, rather than as some kind of revolutionary. The inscription says, translated, it's in Spanish, of course, "For Leon Trotsky, with all love, I dedicate this painting on 7th of November, 1937. And she certainly does date all her work. This date has particular meaning. It is the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. It is Trotsky's birthday, and it's the day that presumably she presented the painting to him. Now, one of the questions, I guess, that rises because we like to label people, and we like to put them into periods. It's a way of organizing. I once had a professor that said, "Oh, never tell people periods. They're not real." And I thought, yeah, but then you don't have an organization. You just have all these, millions and millions, or at least thousands and thousands that we might know, and probably millions and millions of existed artists. And, it does help to organize history if you have names for it, even if you have to go around making qualifications. So we have to make a qualification. Generally, in books, Frida Kahlo is always associated with Surrealism. And as she says she's not a Surrealist, but this is where she's always placed. Evidently, she wasn't intending to follow the Surrealist agenda, but her work has many connections with it. When André Breton, who was the founder of Surrealism, came to North America, he came to Mexico and saw her work, he called her a natural surrealist. And he claimed her for his movement. He helped her arrange her first one-person exhibit in New York in 1938. And then he proposed that she come to Paris for an exhibit the following year. Now, what's really horrible here is she arrived with her artwork, and Breton hadn't done a thing. He didn't follow through. Fortunately, she had another friend, very famous one, Marcel Duchamp, who intervened and arranged her Paris exhibit. As I said, most of her work is self-portraits. So we're seeing all of these different self-portraits. In this case, I would like to know, what do all of the objects mean? But we'll just have to look at them, and you'll have to make, I guess, your own determination. With these two, we see her up against sort of lush tropical foliage. Presumably this idea of Mexico is this tropical, semi-tropical area. And she has animals. She has a monkey, and there's a number of portraits of her with a monkey. And in the one case, there's a black cat and a necklace of thorns rather than a crown of thorns. Some people have compared this to the kind of religious imagery that you see in Mexico, but of course, instead of Christ with a crown of thorns, she has this around her neck and over her shoulders. And then there is this a dead bird hanging from it? What does this all mean? The other one has the monkey, and I'm not quite sure what that is wrapped around her neck. Is it bones? Is it shells? I don't know. But the self-portrait with the thorn necklace and hummingbird. The hummingbird is what's hanging from her necklace. So, this fragile little thing that is now entrapped, dead, is that a metaphor for her and her life? Like I say, I don't know. Another self-portrait. Now, one of the things that she was very concerned with, of course, was the Mexican nationalism and the Mexican Revolution. And she would, as we said, she would wear native dress and a native hairstyle. She would braid her hair with ribbons and put flowers in them. This was the influence of the Native American, Mexican peoples. It's the influence of Mexican folk art, where you have bright colors, simplified forms. And one of her works that deals with this identification with the Mexican people shows her conflict. A very famous painting called The Two Fridas. And it is a visual expression of the internal conflict within herself, probably on many different levels. On one level, it's her dual ethnic heritage. Her father is European. He's a German. Her mother was Mexican, and at least in part, her heritage was those of her native peoples. So here we see the two Fridas, essentially. The European Frida, dressed in what might be a beautiful Victorian white lace dress, lots of ruffles and embroidery and frills. And then the Mexican Frida in the native dress. Now, there's a very famous quotation that says that she felt that her husband, Diego Rivera, loved only one of the Fridas. The problem that I have had is finding out which one. We had a textbook that said he loved only the European Frida. And when I was preparing this, I wanted to see if I could find exactly what was said, and I found on the Tate Gallery's website some materials that they had put up about Frida Kahlo, which was really helpful. They were for study materials. They were to help educators. And they said that she said that Diego Rivera loved only the Mexican Frida. So I figured that the Tate was pretty authoritative, so I would use that. But I just caution you that you may find other books saying exactly the opposite. And I'm sure that the specialists know where the mistake came from, but I'm a 15th century specialist. Now, let's go back and look at the two Fridas. Obviously, there is the conflict. She feels that Diego only loves half of her. He doesn't love the full Kahlo. He only loves maybe a certain image. She's conflicted. There's both colonial and native blood, as they often say, or heritage. And this painting does have to do with blood. She sees herself twice, this dualism, with the heart shown on the breast. So you can see the internal heart, not on your sleeve, but literally on her chest. And the two hearts are linked by a blood vessel, an aorta, something like that. And they're dripping blood. And as you can see, the one of the blood vessels goes down onto the white skirt and is dripping blood. It almost looks like part of the embroidery design, except it's trying to be cut off with, I guess it's a hemostat or something. There's a couple of ways you can interpret that. It could refer to that bus accident that left her with the lifelong pain, the repeated surgeries. It could be also, the pain of her relationship with Diego Rivera. Her heart is bleeding. We talk about wearing your heart on your sleeve. Well, here, it's not the sleeve, it's right out in front. And her heart is bleeding. This was the period in which they were divorced. And certainly there is reference to this because I wish I had a detail, but I don't. In the hand of the Mexican Frida, just sort of see a little teeny kind of roundel there. It has a miniature with Diego's picture in it. So she's holding, Diego Rivera, even though they're divorced. As I said, it was a very short-lived divorce. They got divorced, and the next year they got married again. That interest in the native culture even shows up in this particular self-portrait, where she is showing herself in the native garment of her mother's people. Tehuana, I guess would be. Self-portrait is Tehuana. And then it has the subtitle, Diego on My Mind, and as you can see, right up there on her forehead, almost like a tattoo, but is showing you what's in her head. Diego, it's a portrait of Diego Rivera, and he's on her mind. It's showing the native dress, but of course Kahlo isn't really from that culture. She's identifying with it, she's championing it, but she herself is from the intelligentsia. You know, she's got the education of the European type of education. I don't mean she was educated in Europe. So she's really not, you know, a true native American by culture, but I guess you could say she's showing her sympathy. She's showing her part of her ethnic heritage here. And this is the statement. She's saying that the native dress is not just, you know, some beautiful decorative form. It's not just saying, yes, these are my mother's people. It's also a political statement. The classic Mexican dress has been created by people for people. The Mexican women who do not wear it do not belong to the people, but are mentally and emotionally dependent on a foreign class to which they wish to belong. That is, the great American and French bureaucracy. And yet, you know, she has the connections with the non-native Mexican people. So she is conflicted. And there's no reason why she should have to choose one or the other, I wouldn't think. 1943, she's back with Rivera. She shows herself with roots growing out of her body and bearing leaves. Occasionally, very occasionally, she will do a portrait of someone else. And so we hear Donna Rosita Morillo from 1944. Very simplified forms, sort of old woman knitting. But most of the time, her subject is herself. And I'm sure this is very symbolic, but you know, once again, I don't know exactly what the symbolism is. The little deer is, and it has her face, her head. Is this because she feels hunted, because she feels frightened, because she feels vulnerable? I'm speculating. Here we have another self-portrait here with the self-portrait with loose hair. And we have the inscription, which you can probably read. At least when it's blowing up, you can. It's pretty clear. And so here, translating. Here I paint myself, Frida Kahlo, with the mirror image. So presumably she's painting herself in the mirror, and you think that goes clear back to, Marcia, to Greek art, where we have the female artist painting herself in the mirror. I have 37 years. I'm 37 years old, and it is the month of July of 1947. And once again, forgive my pronunciation, Coyoacán, Mexico, the place where I was born. So it's very interesting because it's kind of asserting identity. Here I am now. This is where I came from. Now, one of the images that certainly, I guess I should say something else about the Surrealism. One of the reasons, obviously, that the Surrealist embraced her was because she used such imagery that almost seemed to be dream imagery. Now she says, I'm not painting my dreams, I'm painting my reality. But she's doing it with the same tools, essentially. This has quite a long title. The Love Embrace of the Universe, I think we'll use that as our short title. The Love Embrace of the Universe, the Earth, identified as Mexico, me, that's Frida Kahlo, Diego, and Senor, and here I have no idea how you pronounce this, Zolotl? We'll talk about that in a moment. You have this large figure here divided between light and dark, you know, the sun and the moon essentially, the planets, which is a female personification of the universe wrapping her arms around all of them. And then within that, there is the dark body and head of the earth, which here it's identified as the Earth of Mexico, with the different plants that grow up around them. And she is holding, embracing almost in her lap, Frida Kahlo. And Frida is holding Diego in her lap. He's an adult, but he's being held like a baby. Right in the middle of his forehead, there is the third eye. So she's borrowing iconography from different cultures. The third eye, of course, is from Indian and Hindu culture. In this case, she's using it slightly differently to indicate his artistic genius. And yet she's still, it's interesting because the relationship has changed from that earlier picture of where she's holding Diego's hand and she is sort of the submissive wife. And now she's the one who's taking care of him, essentially. You know, he's a big baby. And so I suppose in one way she's finding her identity as almost like an earth mother that cares for her husband/child, maybe. Part of this, they suggested, may be a way of reconciling herself to his many infidelities, to regard them as childish behavior. At least that's one interpretation. It's really hard to see this in the reproduction, but there is blood on Kahlo's cheeks and her breast, and what may look like a red necklace is actually blood, as though her neck has been slashed. So once again, there is this pain and this suffering. The psychological suffering, perhaps, comes out in the blood, as well as her physical suffering. Now, who is this Senor Zolotl? When I read that, I looked around to see who it was in the picture, and there was the little dog curled up right next to the arm of the universe. And I thought, I bet that's her dog's name. And it is a Mexican, it is a Aztec deity who is the twin of Quetzalcoatl. And he's shown with the head of a dog. He's the dog, the Aztec dog god. So he's a Mexican god dog, as it were. And she's named her dog this. Well, I've named my animals interesting things too. After saints and artists and all sorts of things. The Aztec dog god does carry the dead to the underworld and is also associated with things like physical disability and illness. So there's a kind of double meaning. You know, her little dog is in the picture, but he also has this whole weight of symbolism on in his name. And this is one of her later pictures, self-portrait with Dr. Farill. That is her doctor. And she's showing herself painting the portrait of the doctor. And she is in a wheelchair. If you can see, her health was deteriorating. She had to have part of her right leg amputated in 1954. However, she did have her first one-person show in Mexico in 1954. She was in very bad physical shape, so she wanted to attend. And so what she did was have a bed brought into the exhibition space, and she couldn't walk. She couldn't even sit up in the wheelchair to come in. She was literally carried in on a stretcher so she could attend her exhibition. And of course, she died the following year in 1955.